Hello, bonjour and welcome to your new Bonheur Private Wines video. Today I want to talk to you and explain why you see the mention old vines on certain wine labels. Why do some wineries emphasize this aspect of viticulture in their marketing? Why and how wines made from old vines are different? Are they supposed to be better? How and why? You don't see cheesemakers boast about their cheese being made from the milk of an old cow, do you? So why old vines? We'll also see how old vines need to be called that. Let's go. Just so you have the background information and you understand what we're talking about here really well and how viticulture works, let's briefly go through the life cycle of a vineyard. How old do grapevines live for, etc. So to start a vineyard on a piece of land, you obviously need to plant vines, and baby vines at that. They are generally 1 or 2 years old already when you buy them from the nursery, so they are old enough to survive in the wild, in the field. They're still really tiny though, and they won't start producing grapes before 2 or generally even 3 years after planting. Through the first years after planting, you hardly get any grapes. Vines really only start producing at their full capacity after 4 or 5 years. So it does take time to establish a vineyard properly. Now, after those 5 years, vines are very vigorous. They're young and full of energy, and they tend to produce a lot of fruit. They're at the peak of their production capacity from those 5-6 years of age after planting up to around 15-20 years old. From there, 20-year-old vines slowly start producing a little bit less year after year. The yields steadily decrease from 20 to 40 years old, at which point it becomes too expensive, generally speaking, to maintain the vineyards for those low yields that they deliver. It's not economically viable anymore, and it's generally best to consider replanting a vineyard after around, say, 35 to 45 years of production. This is about the standard life cycle span of a vineyard in most wine growing regions around the world. Although in some really dry areas, arid climates, vines will take longer to grow and reach full production capacity, and their yield is also lower. They produce less fruit all throughout their life, but they will age for longer. So in some areas, vines can grow much gnarlier and much older and still produce relatively decent amounts of grapes, at least relative to the area, the standard yield in the area, even at 60, 80, 100 years of age. At the opposite side of the spectrum, if you irrigate young vines massively and if you push them to produce as much as possible when they're 5 to 20 years old, they'll age much faster and the production will decline faster as well. You might have to replant them as soon as after 20-25 years to really maintain these high levels of production. The life cycle of a grapevine is actually not that dissimilar to one of a person. Totally unproductive initially, then very strong and productive for a while, and then fitness slowly fades away. But the question is, what does that do to the quality of our wine? So how are the wines different depending on the vine's age? Surprisingly, the very first few years of production can be fantastically good, astonishing. The first 1 or 2 crops from a very young vineyard sometimes can give exceptional wines, and that's because the yields are still generally extremely low. Each plant just produces 1, 2, 3 small bunches with very small berries as well. And it really seems that very young vines care a lot about their first babies. So the grapes are excellent. And this often misleads new vineyard owners because it can bring them to believe when they make their first few wines for the first 1 or 2 vintages in a new area. They can believe that they've hit the jackpot and found the best vineyard site ever in the world because they get such fantastic results, fantastic wines straight away. But after these couple of golden years, well, the quality of grapes drops dramatically as the young vines start pumping out a lot more grapes and producing way more. Wines made from young vines from say 4, 5 to about 10 years old are more diluted. Tannins can be a bit harsher as well. Wines are both looser on the palate and can be more aggressive. It's only after about 10 years that you really start revealing the full sustainable potential of a given vineyard. Once yields are settled down to a consistent level after the vine's adolescence, if you wish, that takes about 10 years. Vines will then produce a relatively consistent quality vintage after vintage between say 10 to 20, 25 years of age. So most wines that you buy are produced from vines in this age bracket. Now after 20, 25, 30 years, it is when you start entering the old vines territory, and we may start making noticeably better wines. And so when vines are older, as we discussed earlier, yields gradually start getting lower. Each vine produces a little less grapes vintage after vintage, but these smaller, scarcer grapes tend to contain a little less water and sugar, but gather more nutrients, more tannins, more aromas, more concentration really overall. It's almost like grapevines after 20 plus years of experience making grapes for winemaking and nurturing and babysitting those grapes for 20 years, they've really become experts at it. They nurture the grapes better, they produce less grapes, but that make for better, more complex, deeper and more refined wines. From old vines, tannins are a little more subtle, flavors are less upfront fruity, less explosive perhaps, but they are more varied as well, more complex, more spices, more savory notes, more herbal characters, more earthiness as well, more mineral characters as well. This is of course not literally explained by the vines acquiring scales, but it's simply because old vines have much deeper root systems. They explore more layers and deeper layers of earth under the soil surface. They may reach pockets of clay, a pocket of rock, a pocket of limestone, some gravels, varied geological layers essentially. They express the depth of the terroir more and better, the fuller variety of soils that's underneath them when they are older. While young vines just get what they need, a few simple nutrients and water from the very topsoil, old vines go profound and they gently and slowly pump up and feed these rare nutrients from deep down under to smaller and more concentrated grapes. This is why wines made from old vines are often thought after more highly regarded as well, because they often taste deeper, softer, more complex. There's generally something really quite magical about them that's actually a little hard to explain, but you feel it when you taste it. Wines from old vines are more expensive to produce as well, but often they're better, which is why wineries sometimes bottle them separately and will write old vines or vieilles vignes in French on the label. Now, often wines from old vines and younger vines are just simply blended together. That's why you do not come across old vine wines all that much. Younger vines will bring more fruitiness and more power in the blend, while old vines add in more subtleties and more depth, more earthiness, which actually works together really well in a blend. As a winemaker, you don't need to bottle your old vines separately, but you can. Although it may mean that your wines, your other wines made only from younger vines, are going to be a little weaker and lack this deeper component in the blend. It's a choice. Some bottle them separately, some blend them together. Finally, how old do vines need to be called old vines? Well, that can be a little bit of a problem. There is no official regulations about it, I think anywhere, not in Europe, not in the US. Unfortunately, old vines is more of a marketing term than a really verified, controlled claim. So for some producers, 35, 40-year-old vines might be called old, while on other estates, old vines might mean 60 years old, 80 years old, 100 years old, 100 plus years old. It does depend on the region as well. As we said before, in drier climates, vines tend to age better and longer than under cooler, wetter conditions. So old vines from drier regions are going to be older. Generally though, producers do not abuse the term old vines. In theory, they could make an old vine wine from, say, a 15-year-old vineyard because it's not controlled legally. It's not a legal mention, but really it's not common practice to do that. There's of course a question of trust before the consumers and the winery's reputation, which is very important for wine producers. So old vine wines are generally made from some of the oldest vineyards at a winery's estate, essentially, to summarize. And this is, I think, pretty much everything you needed to know about old vines, except perhaps that it's said vieille vigne in French, as I said before, but viñas viejas in Spanish, or vigne vecchie in Italian, or alte Reben in German. Excuse my German. And now I think you know it all about old vines. And that was it for me today. Thanks for watching, and I will see you soon in the wonderful world of wine, of vino, something.